In the quiet heart of a wildlife sanctuary, a routine morning was about to be shattered. Wildlife rehabilitators thought they'd seen everything until animal control called about a bobcat. With what should have been a 20-pound predator, the staff couldn't believe their eyes. A severely overweight bobcat, weighing an astonishing amount, far beyond what's healthy for a wild feline. At 43 pounds, the bobcat could barely lift his head, let alone walk. His massive body sagged like an overstuffed beanbag, and he moved with great effort, clearly suffering. A woman visiting the center to drop off supplies locked eyes with the bobcat and, despite his wild nature, saw something in him. Tired, but still hopeful. On impulse, she offered to foster him through the center's wildlife rehabilitation program. Journey with us as we uncover the incredible story of one obese bobcat who could barely move, and the astonishing events that followed, changing everything forever. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel parking lot of Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in northern Colorado. Margaret Thompson pulled her pickup truck to a stop, the bed loaded with donated blankets and medical supplies she'd collected from veterinary clinics across Denver. At 62, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands weathered from decades of outdoor work, Margaret had been volunteering at wildlife centers since her retirement from teaching 5 years ago. She hefted a box of supplies and made her way toward the main building, breathing in the crisp mountain air mixed with the earthy scent of pine needles. The center sat on 20 acres of protected land, housing everything from injured eagles to orphaned bear cubs. Margaret had seen it all, or so she thought. "Margaret! Thank goodness you're here," called Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the center's head veterinarian, rushing out to meet her. The usually composed vet looked frazzled, her dark ponytail askew and her scrubs bearing mysterious stains. "What's wrong, Becca?" Margaret set down the box, concern creeping into her voice. "We got a call from Animal Control in Fort Collins. They're bringing in a bobcat, but Margaret, they say he weighs 43 pounds. Margaret's eyes widened. A healthy male bobcat typically weighed between 20 and 30 pounds. "That can't be right." "That's what I said, but they swear they weighed him twice." Dr. Martinez rubbed her temples. Apparently, some elderly man had been keeping him illegally as a pet for years, feeding him dog food and table scraps. The man passed away last week, and the neighbors called authorities when they heard yowling from the house. 20 minutes later, the animal control van pulled up. Margaret watched as 2 officers struggled to carry a large crate toward the intake area. Even from a distance, she could see the massive form pressed against the bars. When they set the crate down and opened it, Margaret's heart clenched. The bobcat that emerged, if you could call it emerging, barely moved. His body sagged like an overstuffed beanbag, fur matted and dull. He attempted to take a step, but his legs trembled under the weight. With visible effort, he managed to drag himself a few inches before collapsing, sides heaving. "Oh my God," whispered Dr. Martinez. The bobcat's amber eyes, still wild despite his condition, swept across the gathered humans. When his gaze met Margaret's, something passed between them. A flicker of exhaustion mixed with a desperate, fragile hope. In that moment, Margaret saw not just an obese animal, but a soul trapped in a body that had betrayed him. "Set up the quarantine enclosure," Dr. Martinez commanded her staff. "We need a full health assessment immediately." As the team carefully transferred the bobcat using a specialized sling, Margaret found herself following. She couldn't shake the image of those eyes, so tired yet somehow still fighting. The examination revealed the full extent of the crisis. At 43 pounds, the Bobcat was nearly double his healthy weight. His breathing was labored, joints swollen, and he couldn't groom himself, hence the matted fur. Blood tests showed dangerously high cholesterol and the beginnings of fatty liver disease. "Prognosis?" Margaret asked quietly as they watched the Bobcat through the observation window. He lay on his side, barely moving except for the rise and fall of his distended belly. Dr. Martinez sighed. "If we don't act fast, he'll die. The weight is crushing his organs, his joints are failing, and his heart is working overtime. But we have to be careful. Too rapid weight loss in cats can cause hepatic lipidosis, which is fatal." "What's the plan?" "Specialized diet, carefully monitored. Physical therapy once he can move. It's going to take months, maybe a year." The vet paused. "We're already stretched thin with the Eagle rehabilitation program and those orphaned cubs. I don't know if we have the resources for this level of intensive care." Margaret heard herself speaking before she'd fully formed the thought. "What if I fostered him?" Dr. Martinez turned to her in surprise. "Margaret, this isn't like fostering a domestic cat. He's still a wild animal, even in this condition. It would require daily care, strict protocols." "I know." Margaret's voice was firm. "I've got the space. That converted barn on my property. I'm here every day anyway. Let me do this, Becca." After much discussion and paperwork, it was agreed. Margaret would foster the Bobcat through the center's wildlife rehabilitation program, with daily veterinary oversight and strict protocols. 3 days later, after the initial medical stabilization, they transported him to Margaret's property. The first weeks were heartbreaking. The Bobcat, whom Margaret had started calling Russell after her late husband, who'd also struggled with his weight, was confused and distressed by the new diet. The carefully measured portions of specialized wild feline food looked pitifully small compared to what he'd been used to. Russell would finish his meal in seconds, then paw at the empty dish, letting out soft, mournful growls that sounded almost like questions. He'd drag himself to the enclosure door when Margaret appeared, amber eyes following her every movement, clearly begging for more food. "I know, buddy," Margaret would say softly, sitting just outside the enclosure. "I know you're hungry, but this is for your own good." She began spending hours with him, reading aloud from books or simply sitting quietly. Gradually, Russell seemed to understand that while the food was limited, her presence was not. He'd position himself as close to her as the enclosure allowed, sometimes attempting a rusty purr that sounded more like a wheeze. The weekly weigh-ins became events of both hope and frustration. The first week, he'd lost half a pound. The second week, nothing. Dr. Martinez assured Margaret this was normal. His metabolism was adjusting. By the third week, Russell had lost 2 pounds total, and the changes, though subtle, were beginning. He could lift his head higher and had started attempting to groom his front paws, though he couldn't quite reach. "Look at you," Margaret encouraged one morning, watching him struggle to clean himself. "You're trying so hard." As if understanding her words, Russell paused in his efforts and looked at her. Then, for the first time, he attempted to stand fully on all 4 legs. He managed 3 seconds before his hind legs gave out, but Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "You did it. You stood up." That small victory marked a turning point. Russell began attempting more movement each day. Margaret created little challenges, placing his food dish a few inches farther away each meal, encouraging him to move for it. She introduced toys, feathers on strings, balls with bells inside, and watched with delight as his predatory instincts flickered to life. One morning in the second month, Margaret arrived to find Russell had managed to climb onto the low platform in his enclosure, barely 18 inches off the ground. But for him, it might as well have been Mount Everest. "Dr. Martinez needs to see this," she breathed, quickly taking a photo. The vet was equally amazed. "His muscle tone is improving. The weight loss is slow but steady. You're doing amazing work, Margaret." But Russell, it turned out, was cleverer than they'd anticipated. One evening, Margaret discovered the storage bin where she kept his food had been pried open, and a significant portion was missing. Russell lay in his enclosure looking suspiciously satisfied, belly distended more than it had been in weeks. "You little sneak." Margaret couldn't help but laugh even as she worried about the setback. "How did you even get out?" Investigation revealed he'd learned to manipulate the simple latch on his enclosure door, a sign of both his improving mobility and his fierce intelligence. Margaret installed more secure locks and moved the food storage, but she was secretly proud of his determination. By month 3, Russell had lost 8 pounds and could walk the full length of his enclosure without collapsing. Margaret expanded his space, adding a safely enclosed outdoor area with natural substrate, logs, and even a small pool for water. The first time Russell experienced rain in his new outdoor space, he sat perfectly still, face turned upward, letting the drops fall on his whiskers. Margaret watched from the shelter of the barn doorway, her heart full. This wild creature, so long denied his true nature, was rediscovering the world. Physical therapy became a daily routine. Margaret, under Dr. Martinez's guidance, created obstacle courses with ramps, different textures to walk on, and platforms of varying heights. Russell approached each challenge with a mixture of caution and determination that reminded Margaret of her students tackling difficult math problems. The breakthrough came in month 7. Margaret had built a wooden ramp leading to a sunning perch about 4 feet high, a height that would be nothing to a healthy bobcat but had remained insurmountable for Russell. She'd tried encouraging him up it for weeks with no success. But on a bright September morning, Margaret arrived to find Russell lounging on the perch, grooming his now glossy coat in the sunshine. "Russell," she exclaimed, "you did it. How did you?" He paused in his grooming to give her what could only be described as a smug look before returning to his task. Margaret immediately called Dr. Martinez, who drove out to see for herself. "Incredible," the vet murmured, watching Russell navigate down the ramp with careful but confident steps. "His muscle mass has improved dramatically. Look at the definition in his legs now." The transformation photos were striking. Side by side, the Russell who'd arrived barely able to crawl looked like a different animal from the one now able to climb and explore. His weight was down to 28 pounds, still a bit heavy but within a healthier range. Word of Russell's progress spread through the wildlife rehabilitation community. Margaret began receiving calls from other centers dealing with overweight animals, casualties of the illegal pet trade or well-meaning but misguided human intervention. She shared her methods, her feeding schedules, her enrichment ideas. "You should write a guide," Dr. Martinez suggested one day as they watched Russell successfully catch a feather toy in mid-leap, something unimaginable months ago. This could help so many animals. The idea grew into something larger. With the center's support and a grant from a wildlife foundation that had heard Russell's story, they established a dedicated wing for overweight wild animals in recovery. Margaret became the lead coordinator, training other caregivers in the patient, compassionate approach that had worked so well with Russell. A year after his arrival, Russell was a different Bobcat. At 26 pounds, he was lean, muscular, and agile. He could leap to platforms 6 feet high, run the length of his expanded enclosure, and his coat gleamed with health. But more than the physical changes, his spirit had transformed. The exhausted, hopeless look in his eyes had been replaced by alertness and contentment. The question of his future had been discussed at length. In an ideal world, Russell would have been released back to the wild. But his years as an illegal pet had left him too habituated to humans, too dependent on provided food. He didn't have the skills to hunt effectively or the wariness needed to survive. "He'll stay here," Margaret announced at the team meeting. As an ambassador animal, his story can help educate people about why wild animals should never be pets and inspire hope for other animals in similar situations. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "The center's board has already approved it. Russell will have a permanent home here, and Margaret, they want you to continue as his primary caregiver." Margaret felt tears well up as she looked through the window at Russell, who was currently stalking a butterfly that had ventured into his enclosure. He pounced, missed, and tried again with determination that would have been impossible in his former state. The dedication ceremony for the new rehabilitation wing was held on a crisp October day. Donors, volunteers, and wildlife professionals gathered to tour the facilities and hear Russell's story. Margaret spoke about the journey, her voice thick with emotion. "Russell taught me that transformation isn't just about losing weight or gaining mobility," she said. "It's about refusing to give up on a life, no matter how dire the circumstances. Every wild animal deserves a chance to be wild again, even if that wildness looks different than we might expect." As if on cue, Russell appeared at the viewing window of his enclosure, surveying the crowd with regal indifference before padding away to investigate something more interesting. Probably the new puzzle feeder Margaret had installed that morning. In the months that followed, Russell's story inspired the rescue and rehabilitation of dozens of overweight wild animals. From a fox who'd been fed pizza by well-meaning campers, to a raccoon who'd lived on a diet of pastries behind a bakery. Each animal that came through the program carried Russell's legacy. The belief that with patience, proper care, and unwavering commitment, even the most compromised wild animal could find their way back to some version of their true nature. Margaret continued to care for Russell, their daily interactions a dance of mutual respect and understanding. He would never be fully wild, and she would never forget that he wasn't a pet. But in the space between those two truths, they had forged something unique, a partnership that had saved his life and changed hers. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sit outside Russell's enclosure, watching him explore and play with an energy that still amazed her. Sometimes he would pause in his activities and look at her, those amber eyes now bright and clear, and she would remember that first day, the despair she'd seen there and the fragile hope that had prompted her impulsive offer to help. "We did it, Russell," she would whisper. "We really did it." And Russell, in his way, seemed to agree, often choosing to settle down near where she sat, his purr, now strong and healthy, rumbling through the evening air. He was living proof that every life had value, that transformation was possible, and that sometimes the most unexpected connections could change everything forever. The Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center's new wing continued to grow, taking in animals from across the western United States. Each success story added to the knowledge base Margaret had started with Russell. Veterinarians, wildlife biologists, and caregivers came to study their methods, taking back techniques that would help animals in their own regions. Russell became something of a celebrity in wildlife rehabilitation circles. His transformation videos went viral, not for entertainment, but for education, showing people the real consequences of keeping wild animals as pets and the intensive care required to undo the damage. School groups visited to learn his story, always supervised and at a safe distance, with Margaret explaining how his previous life had nearly killed him. Wild animals have specific dietary and environmental needs, she would tell the wide-eyed children. Russell's first owner might have loved him, but love isn't enough. These animals need to be wild, to eat what their bodies are designed for, to move as nature intended. 3 years after his arrival, Russell developed arthritis in his joints, a lasting consequence of carrying so much extra weight. But with medication and modified enrichment activities, he remained active and engaged. Margaret adapted his environment again, adding heated platforms for cold days and lower perches for when climbing was difficult. "You're getting older just like me," she told him one snowy morning, watching him luxuriate on his heated rock. "But we're not giving up, are we?" Russell's legacy extended far beyond his own recovery. The rehabilitation wing he'd inspired had treated over 100 animals, with a success rate that attracted national attention. Margaret received an award from the National Wildlife Federation for her innovative approaches to wildlife rehabilitation, though she always insisted Russell was the real hero. "I just listened to what he was telling me," she said in her acceptance speech. "These animals communicate their needs if we're willing to pay attention. Russell showed me that recovery isn't a straight line. It's a journey with setbacks and breakthroughs, requiring patience and creativity." The program expanded to include preventive education, reaching out to communities where wildlife-human interactions were common. They developed materials in multiple languages, recognizing that cultural differences in attitudes toward wildlife needed to be addressed with sensitivity and respect. Russell lived another 6 years, reaching the respectable age of 11. Not unusual for a bobcat in captivity, but remarkable given his early health crisis. His final years were peaceful, spent lounging in sunny spots, playing with puzzle feeders, and serving as a gentle ambassador for his species. When he passed peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning, Margaret found him curled in his favorite spot, looking as if he were simply napping in the sunshine. The grief was profound, but so was the gratitude for the years they'd shared and the countless lives his story had touched. The center held a memorial service, attended by staff, volunteers, and many of the professionals who'd learned from Russell's case. Margaret spoke through tears about the bobcat who'd changed her life and revolutionized their approach to wildlife rehabilitation. Russell showed us that every animal, no matter how compromised by human interference, deserves compassion and the chance to reclaim their dignity, she said. He taught us that wildness isn't just about living in nature. It's about honoring the essential nature of each creature. Russell's enclosure was transformed into a memorial garden with native plants and a plaque telling his story. But his true memorial lived on in the continued work of the rehabilitation wing, in every animal given a second chance, and in the hearts of those who'd witnessed his remarkable transformation. Margaret continued her work for many more years, often feeling Russell's presence in the quiet moments. When facing a particularly challenging case, an obese coyote or an overfed owl, she would remember Russell's determination and find renewed strength. The ripple effects of one obese bobcat's recovery spread far and wide. Wildlife centers across the country implemented similar programs. Legislation was strengthened regarding the keeping of wild animals as pets. Public awareness grew about the importance of leaving wildlife wild. And in the quiet corners of the Colorado mountains, at the Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Russell's story continued to inspire. Each new arrival, each successful recovery, added another chapter to the legacy of the Bobcat who could barely move but refused to give up. Margaret, now in her 70s, still volunteered at the center, sharing Russell's story with new generations of caregivers. She would show them the transformation photos, describe the setbacks and breakthroughs, and always end with the same message. Never underestimate the power of patience and compassion. Russell taught me that wildness can be rediscovered, that damaged bodies can heal, and that the bond between human and wild animal, when based on respect and understanding, can create miracles. Every animal deserves someone who refuses to give up on them. Be that someone. And so Russell's legacy lived on, in every animal saved, in every caregiver inspired, in every child who learned that wild animals belong in the wild. The obese bobcat who could barely move had indeed changed everything, not just for himself, but for countless creatures who would benefit from the compassion and knowledge his journey had inspired. In the end, Russell's story was more than a tale of weight loss or physical recovery. It was a testament to the resilience of life, the power of dedicated care, and the profound truth that every creature, no matter how far they've strayed from their natural state, carries within them the spark of wildness waiting to be rekindled. Through Margaret's unwavering commitment and Russell's indomitable spirit, that spark had grown into a flame that continued to light the way for others, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can indeed change everything forever.